Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
And I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And we want to thank you all for the tremendous feedback we received on our last episode, the episode dealing with Shomer Negiah. We got a lot of emails and a lot of comments, and we appreciate all of them, those that liked it and those that didn't.
In fact, we decided to devote this entire episode, this mini episode, to talking about our listeners' feedback and relating to it.
So we're not going to get to everything that everybody said to us, and we're certainly not going to read the private correspondence we had word for word, but we're going to paraphrase certain comments that seem to be repeating themselves and came up a lot, just so that we can address some of the important issues that your listeners raised.
Yes, and also gives us an opportunity to provide some clarifications and also to get more feedback from you all listening out there as to what you would like us to talk about in the future.
And please remember to keep on telling us what you want, what you would like us to speak about, describe how you like what we said or didn't like what we said, and make sure to please subscribe. Go to intimatejudaism.com and join our mailing list. You can also subscribe on any podcast provider, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, etc.
And I also want to take the opportunity to thank those of you who have provided feedback. As I wrote on my personal Facebook page, I was kind of nervous doing this. It's really a lot of exposure, but people have been extremely supportive. I especially want to thank my many colleagues who wrote in with such meaningful feedback. I am not going to name you by name because I didn't really get a chance to ask permission to do that from any of you. But I do want to get right to the point with some of the emails that we received.
Okay, so let's start off. What was one of the first things that people said to you?
Well, one of the first things that people really appreciated was how we mentioned guilt. And I want to talk a little bit more about that because if people are still bringing it up, it means that we didn't address it enough. And I can understand that actually in some way, these podcasts can be somewhat triggering in a sense because you're listening to a rabbi say, this is an Isur Deoraita, and it reminds you, it triggers you back to earlier conflicts in life.
And certainly when I said, this is Chayav Karet, whatever karet means, and there are all sorts of opinions.
Pretty scary.
It's a scary term. And people said they weren't criticizing the fact that it is Chayav Karet, but they wondered, is that really the right way to go about it? Or perhaps by my saying it, am I causing people to have an inordinate amount of guilt from things that they did a long time ago?
Exactly. And so I'd give you an opportunity to clarify, but I would like to talk about the issue of guilt and shame and kind of also distinguish between the two.
What's the difference between guilt and shame?
Well, you know, guilt is an emotion that we all have when we do something that we feel that we shouldn't. So guilt is like I did something wrong, whereas shame is more like I am something wrong.
So in that sense, is shame almost definitional, meaning I am a bad person, whereas guilt is I'm a good person perhaps, but I did something of which I'm ashamed?
Well, not only that, this something that I did or this something that I was involved in has changed me as a person and has defined me. And I'll give you an example in terms of what we have talked about, how we educate about sexuality. You know, how we teach values and how what we teach can impact the way we view ourselves. So the example I want to bring is the tomato example. Many women who have gone through the Ulpana systems here in Israel can tell you that in high school, the teacher put a tomato on the desk. And
a tomato.
A tomato. This was the class. She put a tomato on the desk.
I don't like where this is going.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think you can figure it out. Each girl was to get up, go to the desk, and touch and feel and kind of fondle the tomato and then put it back on the desk. After the girls, and there's usually about 35 of them in a class, each one touched the tomato. She put the tomato back on the desk, and she said, now, come on, girls, which one of you would actually really want that tomato now?
Mm-hmm.
And the message there is that there is great shame in premarital sexual behavior because it changes who you are. It defines you. It becomes a part of you. It reduces your value. It takes something away. And I think that this method of teaching contributes to those feelings of shame and those ruminating, anxiety-based thoughts of, do I have to disclose any previous relationships and what I did in those relationships? Does this define the person who I am? Is this going to impact my sexual life in the future? And I'm not even talking about having premarital sex. I'm talking about any boy touching you will sully you. And so we really need to revolutionize the way we look at premarital sexual experiences. No, they do not define you. If they were good and healthy experiences, they may help define your sexual sense of self, even in a positive way. But the guilt and shame should not be a defining feature of your sexual sense of self.
Certainly coming from a halachic perspective, no one who is working within a halachic system is going to say that doing this behavior and telling you, oh, this behavior, which is your choice to do, is a halachically valid or acceptable choice from a Torah perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really good point, and that's exactly the job of the rabbis, is to teach the ideal of what the halacha is. But I think at the end of the day, people will decide for themselves how they want to best connect to halacha and adhere to the laws.
I certainly agree with that, and I think that especially this time of year, now we're sitting in the Aseret Teshuvah, which of course is all about repentance. The whole concept, the Jewish concept at least, of repentance is predicated, as I see it, upon the idea that sin is not definitional. Sin is something which you wear, but it's something which you can take off and remove. It's not something which defines who you are fundamentally, which is why we believe in Teshuvah. Without getting into interfaith discussions, other traditions will say, no, it's fundamentally defines who you are and you need something external to make it work. For Jews, we say, no, we pray to God, we do teshuvah, tefillah, tzedakah, etc. We don't have to go through all the Hilchot Teshuvah right now in the Rambam. But the bottom line is that a person can change. A person can say, that's not who I am. And the fact that I might have done something as a teenager or in my 20s or in my 30s or whatever, teshuvah is all about saying, but I'm not doing it now, and I believe that I have a relationship with God which is independent of that.
Talk about karet.
The issue is this, which is that, once again, I'm not going to say that something which is chayav karet, don't worry about it. It's not a serious halachic infraction. If something is chayav karet, that is halacha's way of saying.
Why don't you explain what that actually means, to be cut off?
So the truth is, halacha has different opinions about what it means. There's no one single definition. Generally, at least as it appears in the Torah, it sounds like being cut off from the Jewish people. It's usually v'nichrata me'amav. He will be cut off from his people.
So we don't actually even really understand what karet means.
It's not up to... Chazal certainly have opinions about it. They present different options of what it could mean. Ultimately, I think that's almost beside the point, though. It's a way of saying this is a serious issue. This is not something we should be taking lightly. We have to take it more than lightly. Chayav karet means it's very, very serious. I would say, though, that that's more the way, speaking from my rabbinic perspective, before the fact, if someone is looking at a choice and he says, this is chayav karet, that should give someone serious pause and say, this is serious. Eating on Yom Kippur is chayav karet, for example.
So, Scott,
yes,
Rabbi Scott.
I'm good either way.
Okay. Since we're on the subject of rabbis, a lot of the feedback that we got was about how you kind of emphasized and overemphasized how you must go to a rabbi or a rabbinic authority, and I said a clergy person, because of course I was also including the Maharats and all the other
Yoatzot
Halacha and all the other very learned women in our midst. And your point was you can't make decisions on your own.
Well, no, that wasn't my point. Let me clarify that. So
Good.
First, let me just finish my last point about karet, though. Before I get there, I just want to make one final point about this.
And then you'll talk about.
And then I will talk about
rabbis.
that. No, it's a fair topic, and I think it's important to address. My point in terms of karet is after someone has already done something, being saddled with this guilt of karet is certainly counterproductive. That's not what it's there for, at least in my opinion, in terms of what we're trying to do. To feel after the fact that I did something 20 years ago and I somehow can't wash off that stain or whatever, or even someone said that they feel that those experiences, which they don't do currently, enrich their life on some level. There actually is even a place in halacha to say that. There's a concept that if a person does tshuva me'ahava, define it as you will, then the aveirot, the sins someone once did, become actually zechuyot. They become merits in the future, because we see a person's experiences can help drive them in a certain direction. And if that ultimate direction leads to a closer relationship with God, a closer relationship with Am Yisrael, although halacha will not say, therefore do this sin in advance, after the fact, if it's seen as having had a positive effect in certain contexts, it can be understood that way. So I think the main point I want to make over here is that while again, I can't pretend something that says karet is not karet. After the fact, don't let it get you down to the degree that it can stop you from moving forward. And life is not about being black and white. It's not as simple as you're either a religious Jew or you did this thing bad, so you're not anything at all. There are all sorts of gradations within that.
Hang on. I just want to go back to something you said before when you were talking about doing tshuva. And you said, look, as long as, you did something wrong, but as long as you know that you're not doing it anymore. And that is what I want to just clarify. Yes, there are people who will look at what they did as something that they did wrong and that they want to do tshuva and they want to return. And there are many Orthodox Jews who will integrate their sexuality into their lives out of choice because they understand that this is just too difficult for them to do. And I think we do have to recognize that, maybe it doesn't sound so great from a halachic point of view, but actually from a psychological point of view, it's more healthy to be aware of what you're doing rather than feel that you don't have any control over yourself. We had talked about that splitting before in earlier podcasts.
And I think it's very important, like you're saying right now, to make a distinction as well, that I am describing hilchot tshuva, the way a person repents and returns to God in the classic sources. Far be it from me to tell somebody that I alone and hilchot tshuva alone possess the way to God, and a person can't develop his or her own relationship with God apart from doing what I'm saying. I'm presenting a halachic position, a position with which I agree.
And this is what I think is so great about this podcast, though, because it really does integrate between the rabbinic halachic and the psychological and what is the experience of the person. And I think that rabbis do need to have a lot of awareness of when somebody comes with a question, what's going on with that person and what is behind that question.
It's not like a computer. Halacha is never a computer where a person, or it shouldn't be, where a person simply plugs in the question and the answer comes printed out automatically. The individual who's asking the question is key. And along with that, as I just said, the way a person relates to God remains his personal relationship with God, and that's not mediated by anybody. That's between him and God, and the person has to work out for himself or herself how that's going to be for himself or herself.
Absolutely. And you said that beautifully. I also want to make one more point about doing tshuva. This really is a period of reflection. And when we talk about tshuva and when we talk about sexuality, we also understand that there is a concept of the relationship and the prohibitions between man and God and the prohibitions between man and man. And I also think that in reflecting, we want to think about not only what sins I may have participated in, but also, did I engage in activities in which were non-consensual? Did I hurt anybody in my activities?
Of course.
Did I take advantage of anybody? And I think that that is different than the type of prohibition that might have occurred in a sexual experience which did not have any sort of ill effect on another human being.
These things all have to be brought into the cheshbon. We can't just say, is it one or the other? Very often it includes, as you say, a lot of different elements. And sometimes we have to be sure that one person might be saying al chet because he did some sort of sexual infraction when he doesn't even think about the fact that it perhaps might have been not as consensual as he thought it was, which is another thing which he's not even thinking about of improving in his life. So now I'm going to speak about rabbis and the issue that you brought up a few moments ago, Talli. And those listeners who said that I was saying, which I certainly, I said it, that a person can't make these decisions on his or her own. They need to consult a halachic authority. What I mean by that is that obviously every person has bechira chofshit, every person has freedom of choice, and every person is granted autonomy. We do not live in a Torah theocracy where there is a government imposing how we have to keep halacha. In fact, I think that would be a not good thing. And Rav Soloveitchik says the same thing. Even in the modern state of Israel, he thinks there should not be government-mandated religion. That's an entirely different topic. So I think I'm on firm halachic ground by quoting him when I say this. Everyone has autonomy. All I mean by saying a person should consult a halachic authority, the issue is this, which is that if a person wants to live a halachic lifestyle, halacha is a very broad sea. There's a lot there. It's not easy simply to look something up in a book, a little handbook, and figure out the law. There are certain compendium of halacha which are short. a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch type of thing, and yet they're short because they're a summary and don't deal with all eventualities and don't deal with the subjective aspect, which a rabbi or a clergyman or a clergywoman has to deal with as well. So if a person has that competence, if a person has the ability to look up the sources, I was not saying, as one person thought I was, that they're esoteric and we have to hide them. That's not what I meant. If a person knows how to read them, the same way that a person who is not a lawyer but knows the law is allowed to defend himself in court, by all means, if you understand the halacha, you can make that decision. The problem is that people sometimes don't realize how complicated the situation is, and to simply, based on a couple lines I said in the podcast, decide, oh, now I can determine what's right for me. That's what I meant. A person should go to an authority if that person lacks the competence in halachic reasoning on his or her own.
I understand that. I think as a rabbi, ideally, you would like it if everybody would consult with a halachic authority, male or female. But I look at it more from a sociological lens and what we're seeing actually in real life. And then we also want to look at why is it that people are choosing not to. You may look at speaking to a rabbi, if you don't know the halacha, as the ideal. And some people may not see it as the ideal. They may prefer to learn it on their own or to decide on their own. So I think we just need to be aware that that's what's going on.
And I think it should be added to that as well, that rabbis have a responsibility to be more approachable. There are many rabbis who are very approachable, but I even look back at certain things when I was teaching in yeshiva that I used to say that now I'm a bit older. I've learned some more about hopefully Torah and also about life. And those are things which I wouldn't say them if I were doing it now. I can think back to many examples. I'm sure many people have examples like that. Rabbis need more training and more awareness of this need to be approachable, this need for sensitivity, the need to be able to look at people as individuals without sacrificing an iota of halacha. And also at the same time recognizing what people are going through in their real lives. I think that's very, very important. I do think it's important to add that we should have more women in positions of religious authority. Let's call it for now a yoatzet halacha, someone like that, because even though, thankfully, there are more and more who are finding themselves in positions like that, we need to have more people because women very often will feel very uncomfortable going to a man to discuss issues of sexuality. And they shouldn't have to go to a man. There should be people who are well-versed in these halachot.
I agree. My other point.
Yes.
There seems to be a disparity between what rabbis talk about publicly and what sort of piskei halacha or
halachic
rulings are provided privately. And why that is so is unclear to me. I think maybe there is a general fear that the rabbinate collectively has in the possibility that people might make their own decisions. But if halakha is as flexible as it is when you ask questions privately, why cannot these rulings be published?
So I think the answer is that you're making a good point, and some of them are published. I think you're right, there is a tendency in public to be more machmir, to be more stringent. The reason I would think is partially, I'm sure, fear is an element of it. But in addition to that, because of what I said before, halacha is very, very broad and it can be very individualized. There are all sorts of details that come in. For example, the great posek Rav Moshe Feinstein, he has 9 volumes of responsa. And in his introduction, he says, you cannot use this for practical halacha because each one is individualized. The fact that everyone does anyway is a different point. They are individualized. A great halachic decisor understands that halacha must be individualized, and you have to have the competence to do that. I certainly wouldn't have the competence to do that. So for a person to get up there and make a blanket statement that's lenient, and the Gemara itself says that the power of leniency is greater because it requires greater ability to say, yes, this is okay. But if you're stringent for everybody, it does cover all eventualities. At least no one's going to violate a prohibition by saying that. If they want a lenient opinion, which might be individualized, if you say that publicly, the problem is that you can have the reverse. You're allowing something for people, which really is only allowed for 20% of the population or 60% of the population or even 99% of the population.
Okay,
I'm not necessarily justifying it, but I think that's the logic.
I am appreciating that you and other rabbis do have a great deal of responsibility and take that responsibility very seriously.
Okay.
No, I get it. I mean, but there is a lot of anxiety around what people might do.
At the same time, I do agree with you that it has to be made more clear that if someone's going to go up there and make the following blanket assertion, it must be stated, this is not a blanket assertion. It's a blanket assertion because it's not individualized. And for individual approaches, you either have to acquire the halachic competency to determine whether this applies to you, or discuss it with somebody who is competent in that way.
Right.
Now, admittedly, some people might say, I don't want to discuss with anybody, and I don't have the competence, and I want to do what I want. As you said before, people have autonomy, and that's that person's choice. I would say, though, that you can't say, I'm going to do whatever I want, and still say I'm following the dictates of halacha. There are certain limits after which you say that's not really called halachic anymore. If you don't have the competence to decide whether this is okay and you choose to do it, I'm not saying you're not a halachic Jew, but in this particular manner, it doesn't mean you're acting according to halacha.
Okay.
Is that a fair statement?
I think it's a fair statement, but I also don't think it's such a relevant statement.
Okay, in what way?
People can define themselves as they feel comfortable defining themselves.
Okay, fair enough. I want to mention another thing that somebody mentioned to me. He asked about the text framing we discussed. We discussed that. We've mentioned it in almost every podcast about looking at a woman's little finger and how I had seen that in the past as a form of dictating women to act modestly, whereas you, and I think correctly according to the text itself, pointed it out. A different way of looking at it is a mandate to men not to objectify women, or perhaps, as one person wrote to us, not to treat situations that shouldn't be sexual and turn them into sexual encounters as such. Either way, it's a different way of looking at that same text. So this person asked me, is this true for Shomer Negiah, reframing the text? So I just want to make sure this is clear. No one's saying that we're taking something which is a halachic dictate in Chazal or the Rishonim or the Achronim and saying, I'm going to reread it and change where the commas are, and all of a sudden something which before was prohibited now is permitted. That's not what we're saying. We're saying the way we look at something in terms of our attitudes, the way we think about certain texts. I don't want someone to think that I'm saying halachic practice can be radically changed because, hey, I'll change what this means, even though we all know what it means, into something which is not the literal meaning. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about seeing things with new eyes and having a new approach to different things without saying that, therefore, I'm going to change what it means literally. Just being open to the fact that texts are multifaceted.
And they are dynamic, and they have
certainly
changed according to the times until we stopped being able to do that.
I once heard Rav Schechter talk about the fact that people sometimes treat Judaism, and Torah Judaism in particular, like an antique. Don't touch it. Don't touch. It's an antique, and that's not the way it should be. That's not the way it should be. It doesn't mean that it has to be wanton and people can do whatever they want, but within the halachic system, there is room for flexibility, once again, if one acquires the competence to know how to do it in an honest way as opposed to imposing upon the text something which isn't actually there.
Sounds like this mini episode is getting to be a little bit more than a mini episode. I think that's about it, right, Scott? I mean, I think we had a lot of emails. I don't think we got to all of them.
We certainly have not gotten to all of them. These are some of the ones that stuck out in my mind in terms of being repeated by several people. So that's why we wanted to address these. And also, these are really important issues. I don't want anyone to be left with a mistaken impression, especially since Talli and I are trying to do something which is opening up doors that often are closed. Someone misunderstanding what we mean, I want to make sure we try and correct those misperceptions if at all possible. In order to do that, we really need your feedback. So please continue to write in. We always appreciate all of your feedback and also suggestions for future episodes. In fact, Talli, what are we talking about next time?
Oh, I'm so excited about our next episode. I hope that we can record that really soon. We're going to be talking about the wedding night. There is so much to say about the wedding night. I don't know if I'm going to let you get a word in edgewise for that. But send in your thoughts and questions and points that you would like us to cover.
Write to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Again, that's intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. And you can find us on intimatejudaism.com. We're also available on jewishcoffeehouse.com, as well as all your favorite podcast providers. Please subscribe, write to us, let us know what you think. And thank you so much for all the tremendous feedback, positive and negative. We like it all. It's important to us.
And thank you, and Gemar Chatima Tova.
Gemar Chatima Tova.